Born in 1905 in Paris and dying in 1980, Jean-Paul Sartre witnessed and responded to the most catastrophic events in human history, while developing a philosophical system of unprecedented scope and influence. His work spans the deepest questions of ontology, the structure of consciousness, the nature of human relationships, the foundations of ethics, the dynamics of political oppression, and the role of literature in revealing truth. Few philosophers have been as famous in their own lifetime as him. Many thousands of Parisians packed into his public lecture, "Existentialism is a Humanism," towards the end of 1945, and the culmination of World War II. This extraordinary public response to philosophical ideas reflects the unprecedented relevance of Sartre's thought to lived human experience during a period of unprecedented historical crisis. That lecture offered an accessible version of his difficult treatise, Being and Nothingness, which had been published 2 years earlier, and it also responded to contemporary Marxist and Christian critics of Sartre's existentialism. The philosophical system that emerged from this engagement with historical crisis would fundamentally reshape how we understand human consciousness, moral responsibility, and political action. This analysis will examine every major dimension of Sartre's philosophical achievement through rigorous engagement with the most authoritative academic scholarship. We will trace the development of his thought from his early phenomenological investigations through his revolutionary ontology in Being and Nothingness to his mature political philosophy in the critique of dialectical reason. Each part of this examination will reveal how Sartre's individual insights contribute to a comprehensive vision of human existence that remains profoundly relevant to contemporary philosophical and political challenges. The depth and breadth of Sartre's intellectual achievement demands nothing less than complete philosophical engagement with every aspect of his system. Part 1. The Phenomenological Foundation and Intellectual Development. Sartre's philosophical revolution began with a moment of extraordinary intellectual discovery that would transform 20th century thought. One of the most famous foundational moments of existentialism concerns Sartre's discovery of phenomenology around the turn of 1932 to 33, when, in a Parisian bar, listening to his friend Raymond Aron's description of an apricot cocktail. This seemingly ordinary conversation revealed to Sartre the revolutionary potential of Edmund Husserl's phenomenological method, setting in motion the intellectual development that would culminate in existentialism as a comprehensive philosophy of human existence. From this moment, Sartre was fascinated by the originality and novelty of Husserl's method, which he identified straight away as a means to fulfill his own philosophical expectations, overcoming the opposition between idealism and realism, getting a view on the world that would allow him to describe objects just as he saw and touched them, and extract philosophy from the process. This discovery provided Sartre with the methodological foundation he needed to develop a philosophy that could address the concrete realities of human existence without falling into either abstract idealism or crude materialism. The phenomenological method offered a way to examine consciousness and its objects with unprecedented precision while remaining grounded in lived experience rather than theoretical abstraction. The intellectual formation that prepared Sartre for this philosophical breakthrough reveals the extraordinary breadth of his educational foundation. After a childhood marked by the early death of his father, the important role played by his grandfather, and some rather unhappy experiences at school, Sartre finished high school at the Lycée Henri IV in Paris. This early educational experience in one of France's most prestigious secondary schools provided Sartre with a classical philosophical education that emphasized the history of Western thought, particularly the French rationalist tradition stemming from Descartes. However, it was his subsequent university education that would prove decisive for his philosophical development. After 2 years of preparation, he gained entrance to the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, where from 1924 to 1929 he came into contact with Raymond Aron, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and other notables. The École Normale Supérieure represented the pinnacle of French intellectual culture, and Sartre's experience there immersed him in the most advanced philosophical discussions of his generation. His intellectual relationships with figures like Aron, who would later introduce him to phenomenology, de Beauvoir, who would become his lifelong intellectual companion and fellow existentialist philosopher, and Merleau-Ponty, who would develop his own distinctive phenomenological philosophy, created an intellectual environment of unprecedented richness and philosophical ambition. Following his graduation, Sartre's year in Berlin from 1933 to 1934 proved absolutely crucial to his philosophical development. Sartre became immediately acquainted with Emmanuel Levinas's early translation of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations and his introductory book on Husserl's theory of intuition. He spent the following year in Berlin so as to study more closely Husserl's method and to familiarize himself with the works of his students Heidegger and Scheler. This intensive study of phenomenology provided Sartre with the methodological tools he needed to develop his own distinctive philosophical approach. The encounter with Husserl's analysis of consciousness, Heidegger's fundamental ontology, and Scheler's philosophical anthropology gave Sartre access to the most advanced philosophical developments of his time, while positioning him to make his own revolutionary contributions. With Levinas, and then later with Merleau-Ponty, Ricoeur, and Tran-Duc-Tao, Sartre became one of the first serious interpreters and proponent of Husserl's phenomenology in France. This role as one of the primary introducers of phenomenology into French philosophy placed Sartre at the centre of the most important philosophical developments of the 20th century. However, Sartre's engagement with phenomenology was never merely scholarly or derivative, but immediately creative and transformative. From his earliest encounters with Husserl's work, Sartre began developing his own distinctive interpretation that would ultimately revolutionize phenomenology itself. The philosophical breakthrough that emerged from this intensive study of phenomenology was Sartre's radical reinterpretation of Husserl's concept of intentionality. While he was studying in Berlin, Sartre tried to convert his study of Husserl into an article that documents his enthusiastic discovery of intentionality. It was published a few years later under the title Intentionality, a fundamental idea of Husserl's phenomenology. This early essay, which had considerable influence over the early French reception of phenomenology, reveals the extraordinary originality of Sartre's philosophical vision even in his earliest work. Rather than simply expounding Husserl's ideas, Sartre immediately began developing his own revolutionary interpretation that would transform phenomenology from a primarily epistemological method into an ontological investigation of human existence itself. Purposefully leaving aside the idealist aspects of Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, Sartre proposes a radicalization of intentionality that stresses its anti-idealistic potential. This crucial interpretive move reveals the philosophical boldness that would characterize all of Sartre's mature work. While other philosophers might have been content to work within the framework established by Husserl, Sartre immediately recognized that the concept of intentionality contained revolutionary implications that Husserl himself had not fully developed. By emphasizing the realistic rather than idealistic implications of intentionality, Sartre began developing a philosophical approach that could address the concrete realities of human existence without falling into either subjective idealism or naive realism. Against the French contemporary versions of neo-Kantianism, and more particularly against the kind of idealism advocated by Leon Brunswick, Sartre famously claims that intentionality allows us to discard the metaphysical oppositions between the inner and outer, and to renounce to the very notion of the interiority of consciousness. This philosophical position represents a fundamental breakthrough in 20th century philosophy. By rejecting the traditional philosophical distinction between inner and outer realms, Sartre opened up the possibility of developing a philosophy that could address human consciousness in its concrete worldly engagement, rather than as an abstract epistemological problem. This move would prove absolutely crucial to the development of existentialism as a philosophy capable of addressing the practical realities of human existence in concrete historical situations. If it is true, as Husserl states, that every consciousness is consciousness of something, and if intentionality accounts for this fundamental direction that orients consciousness towards its object and beyond itself, then, Sartre concludes, the phenomenological description of intentionality does away with the illusion that makes us responsible for the way the world appears to us. This insight contains the seeds of Sartre's entire later philosophical system. By understanding consciousness as fundamentally directed toward its objects rather than closed in on itself, Sartre began developing an understanding of human existence as fundamentally engaged with the world rather than separated from it by epistemological barriers. This realistic interpretation of intentionality would provide the foundation for Sartre's later analysis of human freedom, responsibility, and engagement with concrete historical and political realities. Part 2. The Transcendence of the Ego and Consciousness Structure. Sartre's first major philosophical breakthrough came with his revolutionary analysis of the structure of consciousness in The Transcendence of the Ego, written while he was still in Berlin and published in 1936. With this influential essay, Sartre engages in a much more critical way with the conception of the transcendental ego presented in Husserl's ideas and defends his realistic interpretation of intentionality against the idealistic tendencies of Husserl's own phenomenology after the publication of Logical Investigations. This work represents far more than a scholarly commentary on Husserl, but constitutes Sartre's first systematic attempt to develop his own phenomenological philosophy based on a radical reconception of the structure of consciousness itself. The central thesis of the transcendence of the ego challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions of Western philosophy since Descartes: the notion that consciousness requires a substantial ego or self as its foundation. Stressing the irreducible transparency of intentional experience, its fundamental orientation beyond itself towards its object, whatever this object may be, Sartre distinguishes between the dimensions of our subjective experiences that are pre-reflectively lived through and the reflective stance thanks to which one can always make their experience the intentional object towards which consciousness is oriented. This distinction between pre-reflective and reflective consciousness would become absolutely central to all of Sartre's later philosophical work, providing the foundation for his analyses of bad faith, authenticity, freedom and responsibility. One of Sartre's most fundamental claims in Transcendence of the Ego is that these two forms of consciousness cannot and must not be mistaken with one another. Reflexive consciousness is a form of intentional consciousness that takes one's own lived experiences as its specific object. whereas pre-reflexive consciousness need not involve the intentional distance to the object that the act of reflection entails. This crucial distinction reveals the sophisticated phenomenological analysis that underlies all of Sartre's later philosophical insights. Pre-reflective consciousness is not a form of unconsciousness, but rather a mode of awareness that is absorbed in its objects without taking itself as an object of awareness. Reflective consciousness, by contrast, involves a specific intentional act that takes one's own experience as its thematic object, thereby creating the ego as a transcendent object of consciousness rather than as its immanent foundation. In regard to self-consciousness, Sartre argues there is an immediate and non-cognitive form of self-awareness, as well as reflective forms of self-consciousness. The latter is unable to give access to oneself as the subject of unreflected consciousness, but only as the intentional object of the act of reflection, that is, the ego in Sartre's terminology. The ego is the specific object that intentional consciousness is directed upon when performing reflection, an object that consciousness posits and grasps in the same act, and that is constituted in and by the act of reflection. Instead of a transcendental subject, the ego must consequently be understood as a transcendent object similar to any other object, with the only difference that it is given to us through a particular kind of experience, namely reflection. The ego, Sartre argues, is outside in the world. It is a being of the world, like the ego of another. This revolutionary thesis challenges centuries of philosophical tradition that had placed the ego at the center of consciousness as its founding principle. Rather than being the source or foundation of consciousness, the ego emerges only when consciousness takes itself as an object through the specific act of reflection. This means that in our most fundamental relationship to the world, pre-reflective consciousness, there is no ego present at all. When I run after a streetcar, when I look at the time, when I am absorbed in contemplating a portrait, there is no I. In fact, I am plunged in the world of objects. It is they which constitute the unity of my consciousness, but me, I have disappeared. I have annihilated myself. There is no place for me on this level. This analysis reveals the extraordinary phenomenological precision of Sartre's investigations. The streetcar appears to me in a specific way as having to be overtaken in this case, that is experienced as its own mode of phenomenalization, and not as a mere relational aspect of its appearing to me. The object presents itself as carrying a set of objective properties that are strictly independent from one's personal relation to it. The streetcar is experienced as a transcendent object in a way that obliterates and overrides, so to speak, the subjective features of conscious experience. Its having to be overtakenness does not belong to my subjective experience of the world, but to the objective description of the way the world is. When I run after the streetcar, my consciousness is absorbed in the relation to its intentional object, the streetcar having to be overtaken, and there is no trace of the I in such lived experience. This particular feature derives from what Sartre calls the diaphanousness of lived experiences. In a different example of this, Sartre argues that when I perceive Pierre as loathsome, say, I do not perceive my feeling of hatred. Rather, Pierre repulses me, and I experience him as repulsive. Repulsiveness constitutes an essential feature of his distinctive mode of appearing, rather than a trait of my feelings towards him. This analysis reveals how consciousness in its pre-reflective mode is fundamentally oriented towards the world rather than toward itself, experiencing the qualities of objects as objective features of those objects rather than as subjective states of the experiencing consciousness. Sartre concludes that reflective statements about one's ego cannot be logically derived from non-reflective lived experiences. Thus, to say I hate or I love on the occasion of a singular consciousness of attraction or repulsion is to carry out a veritable passage to the infinite. Nothing more is needed for the rights of reflection to be singularly limited. It is certain that Pierre repulses me, yet it is and will remain forever doubtful that I hate him. Indeed, this affirmation infinitely exceeds the power of reflection. This critique of the powers of reflection forms one important part of Sartre's argument for the primacy of pre-reflective consciousness over reflective consciousness, which is central to many of the pivotal arguments of being and nothingness. The philosophical implications of this analysis extend far beyond technical phenomenology into the foundations of ethics, psychology, and political theory. By demonstrating that the ego is not the foundation of consciousness, but rather a construction that emerges through reflection, Sartre opens up the possibility of understanding human existence in terms of fundamental freedom rather than substantial identity. If there is no substantial ego that determines the character of consciousness, then consciousness is fundamentally free to constitute itself through its choices and actions. This insight provides the phenomenological foundation for Sartre's later analysis of radical freedom and the corresponding radical responsibility that characterizes human existence. Sartre devotes a great deal of effort to establishing the impersonal or pre-personal character of consciousness, which stems from its non-egological structure and results directly from the absence of the I in the transcendental field. According to him, intentional consciousness typically involves an anonymous and impersonal relation to a transcendent object that appears with its own objective qualities, independent of any personal relationship to a substantial self. This impersonal character of consciousness would prove crucial to Sartre's later analysis of bad faith, since it explains how consciousness can deceive itself by trying to transform itself into a substantial thing with fixed characteristics. The ego that emerges through reflection is always an attempt to give consciousness a substantial character that contradicts its fundamental structure as pure transparency toward its objects. Part 3. Imagination, Nothingness, and Literary Philosophy. For many of his readers, the book on the imaginary that Sartre published in 1940 constitutes one of the most rigorous and fruitful developments of his Husserl-inspired phenomenological investigations. Along with The Emotions, Outline of a Theory, which was published 1 year before, Sartre presented the study of imagination as an essay in phenomenological psychology, which drew on his lifetime interest in psychological studies and brought to completion the research on imagination he had undertaken since the very beginning of his philosophical career. With this new essay, Sartre continues to explore the relationship between intentional consciousness and reality by focusing upon the specific case of the intentional relations to the unreal and the fictional, so as to produce an in-depth analysis of the great irrealizing function of consciousness. Engaging in a detailed discussion with recent psychological research that Sartre juxtaposes with and against fine-grained phenomenological descriptions of the structures of imagination. His essay proposes his own theory of the imaginary as the corollary of a specific intentional attitude that orients consciousness towards the unreal. In a similar fashion to his analysis of the world-shaping powers of emotions, Sartre describes and highlights how imagination presents us with a coherent world, although made of objects that do not proceed but result from the imaging capacities of consciousness. The object as imaged, Sartre claims, is never anything more than the consciousness one has of it. Contrary to other modes of consciousness, such as perception or memory, which connect us to a world that is essentially one and the same, the objects to which imaginative consciousness connects us belong to imaginary worlds, which may not only be extremely diverse, but also follow their own rules, having their own spatiality and temporality. The island of Thrinacia, where Odysseus lands on his way back to Ithaca, needs not be located anywhere on our maps, nor have existed at a specific time. Its mode of existence is that of a fictional object which possesses its own spatiality and temporality within the imaginary world it belongs to. This analysis reveals the extraordinary sophistication of Sartre's phenomenological investigations as he develops a systematic account of how consciousness constitutes multiple worlds with different ontological structures. The imaginary world is not simply a copy or representation of the real world, but has its own distinctive mode of being that consciousness constitutes through its imaginative acts. Sartre stresses that the intentional dimension of imaging consciousness is essentially characterized by its negativity. The negative act, Sartre writes, is constitutive of the image. An image consciousness is a consciousness of something that is not, whether its object is absent, non-existing, or fictional. When we picture Odysseus sailing back to his native island, Odysseus is given to us as absent to intuition. In this sense, Sartre concludes, one can say that the image has wrapped within it a certain nothingness. However lively, appealing, strong the image, it gives its object as not being. The irrealizing function of imagination results from this immediate consciousness of the nothingness of its object. Sartre's essay investigates how imaging consciousness allows us to operate with its objects as if they were present, even though these very objects are given to us as non-existing or absent. This is, for instance, what happens when we go to the theatre or read a novel. To be present at a play is to apprehend the characters on the actors, the forest of As You Like It on the cardboard trees. To read is to realize contact with the irreal world on the signs. In this world there are plants, animals, fields, towns, people. Initially those mentioned in the book, and then a host of others that are not named but are in the background and give this world its depth. The irreality of imaginary worlds does not prevent the spectator or reader from projecting herself into this world as if it was real. The acts of imagination can consequently be described as magical acts, similar to incantations with respect to the way they operate, since they are designed to make the object of one's thought or desire appear in such a way that one can take possession of it. In the conclusion of his essay, Sartre stresses the philosophical significance of the relationship between imagination and freedom, which are both necessarily involved in our relationship to the world. Imagination, Sartre writes, is the whole of consciousness as it realizes its freedom. Imaging consciousness posits its object as out of reach, in relation to the world understood as the synthetic totality within which consciousness situates itself. For Sartre, the imaginary creation is only possible if consciousness is not placed in the midst of the world as one existent among others. For consciousness to be able to imagine, it must be able to escape from the world by its very nature. It must be able to stand back from the world by its own efforts. In a word, it must be free. In that respect, the irrealizing function of imagination allows consciousness to surpass the real so as to constitute it as a proper world. The annihilation of the real is always implied by its constitution as a world. This capacity of surpassing the real to make it a proper world defines the very notion of situation that becomes central in Sartre's philosophical thought after the publication of The Imaginary. Situations are nothing but the different immediate modes of apprehension of the real as a world. Consciousness's situation in the world is precisely that which motivates the constitution of any irreal object and accounts for the creation of imaginary worlds, for instance, and perhaps above all, in art. Every apprehension of the real as a world tends of its own accord to end up with the production of irreal objects, since it is always, in a sense, free nihilation of the world, and this always from a particular point of view. With this conclusion, which prioritizes the question of the world over that of reality, Sartre begins to move away from the realist perspective he was initially aiming at when he first discovered phenomenology, so as to make the phenomenological investigation of our being in the world his new priority. This development reveals the systematic character of Sartre's philosophical development, as each work builds upon the insights of the previous works while opening up new dimensions of analysis that will be developed in subsequent investigations. Although Sartre never stated it explicitly, his interest in the question of the unreal and imaging consciousness appears to be intimately connected with his general conception of literature and his self-understanding of his own literary production. The concluding remarks of the imaginary extend the scope of Sartre's phenomenological analyses of the irrealizing powers of imagination by applying them to the domain of aesthetics so as to answer the question about the ontological status of works of art. For Sartre, any product of artistic creation, a novel, a painting, a piece of music, or a theatre play, is just as irreal an object as the imaginary world it gives rise to. The irreality of the work of art allows us to experience, though only imaginatively, the world it gives flesh to as an analogon of reality. Even a cubist painting, which might not depict nor represent anything, still functions as an analogon, which manifests an irreal ensemble of new things, of objects that I have never seen nor will ever see, but that are nonetheless irreal objects. Likewise, the novelist, the poet, the dramatist constitute irreal objects through verbal analogies. This original conception of the nature of the work of art dominates Sartre's critical approach to literature in the many essays he dedicates to the art of the novel. This includes his critical analyses of recent writers' novels in the 30s, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Hemingway, Mauriac and others, and the publication in the late 40s of his own summative view, What is Literature? In a series of articles gathered in the first volume of his Situations, Sartre defends a strong version of literary realism that can, somewhat paradoxically, be read as a consequence of his theory of the irreality of the work of art. If imagination projects the spectator within the imaginary world created by the artist, then the success of the artistic process is proportional to the capacity of the artwork to let the spectator experience it as a reality of its own, giving rise to a full-fledged world. Sartre applies in particular this analysis to novels, which must aim, according to him, at immersing the reader within the fictional world they depict so as to make her experience the events and adventures of the characters as if she was living them in first person. The complete absorption of the reader within the imaginary world created by the novelist must ultimately recreate the particular feel of reality that defines Sartre's phenomenological kind of literary realism. Part 4. Being and Nothingness, the Ontological Foundation. Being and Nothingness remains the defining treatise of the existentialist movement, along with works from de Beauvoir from this period such as The Ethics of Ambiguity. Published in 1943 during the German occupation of France, this massive work of over 600 pages laid out Sartre's complete ontological system and established existentialism as a comprehensive philosophy capable of addressing the deepest questions of human existence. We cannot do justice to the entirety of the book here, but we can indicate the broad outlines of the position and examine its most revolutionary insights. In brief, Sartre provides a series of arguments for the necessary freedom of human reality based upon an ontological distinction between what he calls being for itself and being in itself, roughly between that which negates and transcends and the pure plenitude of objects. That kind of metaphysical position might seem to beg the question by assuming what it purports to establish, namely radical human freedom. However, Sartre argues that realism and idealism cannot sufficiently account for a wide range of phenomena associated with negation. He also draws on the direct evidence of phenomenological experience, particularly the experience of anguish. But the argument for his metaphysical picture and human freedom is, on balance, an inference to the best explanation. He contends that his complex metaphysical vision best captures and explains central aspects of human reality that other philosophical approaches fail to adequately address. As the title of the book suggests, nothingness plays a significant role in Sartre's ontological analysis. While Sartre's concern with nothingness might be a deal-breaker for some, following Rudolf Carnap's trenchant criticisms of Heidegger's idea that the nothing knows, Sartre's account of negation and nothingness is nevertheless philosophically interesting and rigorously developed. Sartre does not say much about the genesis of consciousness or the for itself, other than that it is contingent and arises from the effort of an in itself to found itself. He describes the appearance of the for itself as the absolute event, which occurs through being's attempt to remove contingency from its being. Accordingly, the for itself is radically and inescapably distinct from the in itself. In particular, it functions primarily through negation, whether in relation to objects, values, meaning, or social facts. According to Sartre, this negation is not about any reflective judgment or cognition, but an ontological relation to the world. This ontological interpretation of negation minimizes the subjectivist interpretations of his philosophy. The most vivid example he provides to illustrate this pre-reflective negation is the apprehension of Pierre's absence from a café. Sartre describes Pierre's absence as pervading the whole café. The café is cast in the metaphorical shade of Pierre not being there at the time he had been expected. This experience depends on human expectations, of course. But Sartre argues that if, by contrast, we imagine or reflect that someone else is not present, say the Duke of Wellington, an elephant, and so forth, these abstract negative facts are not existentially given in the same manner as our pre-reflective encounter with Pierre's absence. They are not given as an objective fact, as a component of the real. Sartre provides numerous other examples of pre-reflective negation throughout Being and Nothingness. He argues that the apprehension of fragility and destruction are likewise premised on negativity, and any effort to adequately describe these phenomena requires negative concepts, but also that they presuppose more than just negative thoughts and judgments. In regard to destruction, Sartre suggests that there is not less after the storm, just something else. Generally, we do not need to reflectively judge that a building has been destroyed, but directly see it in terms of that which it is not. The building, say, in its former glory before being wrecked by the storm. Humans introduce the possibility of destruction and fragility into the world, since objectively there is just a change. Sartre's basic question is, how could we accomplish this unless we are a being by whom nothingness comes into the world, that is, free? He poses similar arguments in regard to a range of phenomena that present as basic to our modes of inhabiting the world, from bad faith through to anguish. In all of these cases, Sartre argues that while we can expressly pose negative judgments, or deliberately ask questions that admit of the possibility of negative reply, or consciously individuate and distinguish objects by reference to the objects which they are not, there is a pre-comprehension of non-being that is the condition of such negative judgments. Although the for itself and the in itself are initially defined very abstractly, the book ultimately comes to say a lot more about the for itself, even if not much more about the in itself. The picture of the for itself and its freedom gradually becomes more concrete, reflecting the architectonic of the text, which has more sustained treatments of the body, others, and action in the second half. Throughout, Sartre gives a series of paradoxical glosses on the nature of the for itself. That is, a being which is what it is not and is not what it is. Although this might appear to be a contradiction, Sartre's claim is that it is the fundamental mode of existence of the for itself that is future-oriented and does not have a stable identity in the manner of a chair, say, or a penknife. Rather, existence precedes essence, as he famously remarks in both Being and Nothingness and Existentialism is a humanism. In later chapters he develops the basic ontological position in regard to free action. His point is not, of course, to say we are free to do or achieve anything, or even to claim that we are free to project anything at all. The for itself is always in a factical situation. Nonetheless, he asserts that the combination of the motives and ends we aspire to in relation to that facticity depend on an act of negation in relation to the given. As he puts it, action necessarily implies as its condition the recognition of a desideratum, that is, of an objective lack or again of a negatite. Even suffering in itself is not a sufficient motive to determine particular acts. Rather, it is the apprehension of the revolution as possible and as desired which gives to the worker's suffering its value as motive. A factual state, even poverty, does not determine consciousness to apprehend it as a lack. No factual state, whatever it may be, can cause consciousness to respond to it in any one way. Rather, we make a choice, usually pre-reflective, about the significance of that factual state for us, and the ends and motives that we adopt in relation to it. We are condemned to freedom of this ontological sort with resulting anguish and responsibility for our individual situation, as well as for more collective situations of racism, oppression, and colonialism. These are the themes for which Sartre became famous, especially after World War II, and existentialism is a humanism. In Being and Nothingness, he provides various examples that are designed to make this quite radical philosophy of freedom plausible, including the hiker who gives in to their fatigue and collapses to the ground. Sartre says that a necessary condition for the hiker to give in to their fatigue, short of fainting, is that their fatigue goes from being experienced as simply part of the background to their activity, with their direct conscious attention focusing on something else, to being the direct focus of their attention, and thus becoming a motive for direct recognition of one's exhaustion and the potential action of collapsing to the ground. Although we are not necessarily reflectively aware of having made such a decision, things could have been otherwise, and thus Sartre contends we have made a choice. Despite appearances, however, Sartre insists that his view is not a voluntarist or capricious account of freedom, but one that necessarily involves a situation and a context. His account of situated freedom in the chapter Freedom and Action affirms the inability to extricate intentions, ends, motives and reasons from the embodied context of the actor. As a synthetic whole, it is not merely freedom of intention or motive, and hence even consciousness, that Sartre affirms. Rather, our freedom is realized only in its projections and actions, and is nothing without such action. This situated understanding of freedom would prove crucial to Sartre's later political philosophy and his analysis of concrete historical and social conditions. Part 5. Bad Faith and the Structure of Self-Deception. Sartre's account of bad faith is of major interest and represents one of his most influential contributions to 20th century philosophy. It is said to be a phenomenon distinctive of the for itself, thus warranting ontological treatment. It also feeds into questions to do with self-knowledge, as well as serving as the basis for some of his criticisms of racism and colonialism in his later work. His account of bad faith juxtaposes a critique of Freud with its own depth interpretive account, Existential Psychoanalysis, which is itself indebted to Freud, as Sartre admits. We will start with Sartre's critique of Freud, which is both simple and complex, and features in the early parts of the chapter on bad faith in being and nothingness. In short, Freud's differing metapsychological pictures, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, or id-ego, superego, are charged with splitting the subject in two or more in attempting to provide a mechanistic explanation of bad faith, that is, how there can be a liar and a lied to duality within a single consciousness. But Sartre accuses Freud of reifying this structure, and rather than adequately explaining the problem of bad faith, he argues that Freud simply transfers the problem to another level where it remains unsolved, thus consisting in a pseudo-explanation. Rather than the problem being something that pertains to an embodied subject, and how they might both be aware of something and yet also repress it at the same time, Sartre argues that the early Freudian metapsychological model transfers the seat of this paradox to the censor, that is, to a functional part of the brain or mind that both knows and does not know. It must know enough in order to efficiently repress, but it also must not know too much or nothing is hidden, and the problematic truth is manifest directly to consciousness. Freud's explanation is hence accused of recapitulating the problem of bad faith in an ostensible mechanism that is itself conscious in some paradoxical sense. Sartre even provocatively suggests that the practice of psychoanalysis is itself in bad faith, since it treats a part of ourselves as id-like and thereby denies responsibility for it. That is not the end of Sartre's story, however, because he ultimately wants to revive a version of psychoanalysis that does not pivot around the unconscious and these compartmentalized models of the mind. While bad faith is inevitable in Sartre's view, it is also important to recognize that the germ of its destruction lies within. This is because bad faith always remains at least partly available to us in our own lived experience, albeit not in a manner that might be given propositional form in the same way as knowledge of an external object. In short, when I existentially comprehend that my life is dissatisfying, or even reflect on this basis that I have lived an inauthentic life while I am grasping something about myself, I am nonetheless not strictly equivalent or identical with the I that is claimed to be in bad faith. There is a distanciation involved in coming to this recognition and the potential for self-transformation of a more practical kind, even if this is under-thematized in being and nothingness. Sartre gives many examples of bad faith that remain of interest and continue to illuminate contemporary forms of self-deception. His most famous example of bad faith is the cafe waiter who plays at being a cafe waiter and who attempts to institutionalize themselves as this object. While Sartre's implied criticisms of their manner of inhabiting the world might seem to disparage social roles and affirm an individualism, arguably this is not a fair reading of the details of the text. For Sartre we do have a factical situation, but the claim is that we cannot be wholly reduced to it. As Sartre puts it, there is no doubt I am in a sense a cafe waiter. Otherwise, could I not just as well call myself a diplomat or reporter? But if I am one, this cannot be in the mode of being in itself. I am a waiter in the mode of being what I am not. In subsequent work, racism becomes emblematic of bad faith when we reduce the other to some ostensible identity. This connection between bad faith and oppression would prove central to Sartre's later political philosophy and his analysis of colonialism and anti-Semitism. The waiter example reveals the more general structure of bad faith as an attempt to flee from freedom by identifying oneself completely with one's social role or factical situation. The waiter tries to convince himself that he simply is a waiter in the way that a table is a table, thereby denying his freedom to transcend his situation and choose his relationship to his role. It is important to recognize that no project of sincerity, if that is understood as strictly being what one is possible for Sartre given his view of the for itself. Likewise, in regard to any substantive self-knowledge that might be achieved through direct self-consciousness, our options are limited. On Sartre's view, we cannot look inwards and discover the truth about our identity or our own bad faith through simple introspection, because there is literally nothing to observe. Moreover, when we have a lived experience, and then reflect on ourselves from outside, third-personally, we are not strictly reducible to that ego that is so posited. We transcend it. Or to be more precise, we both are that ego, just as we are what the other perceives, and yet are also not reducible to it. This is due to the structure of consciousness and the arguments from Transcendence of the ego. In Being and Nothingness, the temporal aspects of this non-coincidence are also emphasized. We are not just our past and our objective attributes in accord with some sort of principle of identity, because we are also our projects, and these are intrinsically future-oriented. This temporal structure of human existence means that we are always more than our past accomplishments and present situation, always open to future possibilities that can transform the meaning of our past and present. This temporal structure makes bad faith possible, since we can try to identify ourselves completely with our past or present. But it also makes bad faith unstable, since our future-oriented projects constantly threaten to reveal the falseness of such identification. Nonetheless, Sartre argues that it would be false to conclude that all modes of inhabiting the world are thereby equivalent in terms of faith and bad faith. Rather, there are what he calls patterns of bad faith, and he says these are objective. Any conduct can be seen from two perspectives, transcendence and facticity, being for itself and being for others. But it is the exclusive affirmation of one or the others of these, or a motivated and selective oscillation between them, which constitutes bad faith. There is no direct account of good faith in Being and Nothingness other than the enigmatic footnote at the end of the book that promises an ethics. There are more sustained treatments of authenticity in his notebooks, for an ethics, and in Anti-Semite and Jew. The analysis of bad faith reveals the fundamental structure of human consciousness as a being that must choose itself without ultimate foundation. Bad faith represents the attempt to escape this groundless freedom by identifying with fixed roles, past actions, or the gaze of others. However, since consciousness is fundamentally temporal and transcendent, such attempts at self-identification are always unstable and require constant reinforcement through repeated acts of self-deception. The phenomenon of bad faith thus reveals both the inescapable character of human freedom and the equally persistent tendency to flee from that freedom through various forms of self-deception. This analysis would prove central to Sartre's later investigations of authenticity, political oppression, and the possibilities of human liberation. Part 6. The Look and Intersubjectivity. Sartre's work on intersubjectivity represents one of his most original and influential contributions to 20th century philosophy, though it is often the subject of premature dismissal. The hyperbolic dimension of his writings on the look of the other and the pessimism of his chapter on concrete relations with others, which is essentially a restatement of the master-slave stage of Hegel's struggle for recognition without the possibility of its overcoming, are sometimes treated as if they were nothing but the product of a certain sort of mind, a kind of adolescent paranoia or hysteria about the other. What this has meant, however, is that the significance of Sartre's work on intersubjectivity, both within phenomenological circles and more broadly in regard to philosophy of mind and social cognition, has been downplayed. Building on the insights of Hegel, Husserl and Heidegger, Sartre proposes a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for any theory of the other, which are far from trivial. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre suggests that various philosophical positions, realism and idealism and beyond, have been shipwrecked, often unawares, on what he calls the reef of solipsism. His own solution to the problem of other minds consists first and foremost in his descriptions of being subject to the look of another, and the way in which in such an experience we become a transcendence transcended. On his famous description, we are asked to imagine that we are peeping through a keyhole, pre-reflectively immersed and absorbed in the scene on the other side of the door. Maybe we would be nervous engaging in such activities, given the socio-cultural associations of being a peeping Tom. But after a period of time, we would be given over to the scene with self-reflection and self-awareness, limited to merely the minimal understanding that we are not what we are perceiving. Suddenly, though, we hear footsteps, and we have an involuntary apprehension of ourselves as an object in the eyes of another, a pre-moral experience of shame, a shudder of recognition that we are the object that the other sees, without room for any sort of inferential theorizing or cognizing. This ontological shift, Sartre says, has another person as its condition, notwithstanding whether or not one is in error on a particular occasion of such an experience. That is, the floor creaks, but there is no one actually literally present. While many other phenomenological accounts emphasize empathy or direct perception of mental states, Sartre thereby adds something significant and distinctive to these accounts that focus on our experience of the other person as an object, albeit of a special kind, rather than as a subject. In common with other phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty and Scheler, Sartre also maintains that it is a mistake to view our relations with the other as one characterized by a radical separation that we can only bridge with inferential reasoning. Any argument by analogy, either to establish the existence of others in general or to particular mental states like anger, is problematic, begging the question and having insufficient warrant. The look provides immediate pre-reflective evidence of the other's consciousness that bypasses all the traditional epistemological problems associated with knowledge of other minds. Under the gaze of the other, I do not infer that another consciousness exists. I experience myself as being seen, as being the object of another's consciousness. This experience fundamentally transforms my relationship to myself and to my world. The look of the other reveals dimensions of my being that are not accessible to my own consciousness, but that nonetheless belong to my being as it exists for others. I discover myself as having a nature, as possessing qualities and characteristics that I cannot directly experience, but that are nonetheless part of my objective being in the world. The shame that accompanies the experience of being looked at is not simply an emotional reaction, but an ontological recognition of this dimension of my being that exists for others but not for me. In this way, the look reveals the fundamental structure of being for others as an irreducible dimension of human existence. For Sartre, at least in his early work, Our experience of being what he calls a we subject as a co-spectator in a lecture or concert, for example, which involves no objectification of the other people we are with, is said to be merely a subjective and psychological phenomenon that does not ground our understanding and knowledge of others ontologically. Originally, human relations are typified by dyadic mode of conflict best captured in the look of the other and the sort of scenario concerning the keyhole we just considered above. Given that we also do not grasp a plural look, for Sartre, this means that social life is fundamentally an attempt to control the impact of the look upon us, either by anticipating it in advance and attempting to invalidate that perspective through sadism, or by anticipating it and attempting to embrace that solicited perspective when it comes through masochism. In Sartre's words, it is useless for human reality to seek to escape this dilemma. One must either transcend the other or allow oneself to be transcended by him. The essence of the relations between consciousness is not the Mitsane, it is conflict. This pessimistic analysis of human relations reflects Sartre's conviction that consciousness as pure freedom and transcendence cannot coexist with other consciousness without fundamental conflict. Each consciousness seeks to maintain its freedom and transcendence, but the look of the other constantly threatens to transform consciousness into an object, thereby alienating it from its fundamental nature as free subjectivity. However, this conflict is not simply destructive, but also reveals essential truths about human existence. The look of the other makes possible forms of self-knowledge that would otherwise be impossible, revealing dimensions of our being that we cannot access through self-reflection alone. Moreover, the conflict itself presupposes a fundamental recognition of the other as a free consciousness capable of transcendence. Without this recognition, there would be no basis for the conflict that Sartre describes as fundamental to human relations. In this sense, even Sartre's pessimistic analysis contains the seeds of a more positive account of intersubjectivity that would be developed in his later political philosophy. The analysis of the look also reveals the social and political dimensions of human existence that had been less prominent in Sartre's earlier phenomenological investigations. The experience of being looked at is not simply a private encounter between two consciousness, but takes place within concrete social and historical situations that shape the meaning and consequences of that experience. The shame that accompanies being caught peeping through a keyhole is not simply ontological, but also moral and social, reflecting specific cultural norms and expectations about appropriate behaviour. This recognition of the social and historical dimensions of intersubjective experience would prove crucial to Sartre's later development of a political philosophy capable of addressing concrete forms of oppression and domination. The look also reveals the embodied character of human consciousness that had not been fully developed in Sartre's earlier analyses of pure consciousness. The experience of being looked at is necessarily the experience of having a body that can be seen and evaluated by others. This body is not simply an object among others, but the fundamental medium through which consciousness exists in the world and encounters other consciousness. The look thus reveals the embodied character of human existence as neither pure consciousness nor mere physical object, but as embodied consciousness existing in concrete relationships with other embodied consciousness. This insight would prove essential to Sartre's later political philosophy and his analysis of concrete forms of social and economic oppression. Part 7. Authenticity and the possibility of good faith. The analysis of bad faith naturally leads to questions about the possibility of authentic existence and what Sartre calls good faith. From the beginning to the end of his philosophizing, Sartre appears to have been concerned with bad faith, our natural disposition to flee from our freedom and to lie to ourselves. Virtually no aspect of his monumental system has generated more attention, yet bad faith has been plagued by misinterpretation and misunderstanding. At the same time, Sartre's correlative concepts of good faith and authenticity have suffered neglect or insufficient attention, or been confused and wrongly identified by Sartre scholars, even by Sartre himself. The challenge is distinguishing these concepts and showing whether either or both existential attitudes afford deliverance from the hell of Sartre's bad faith. Although he attempts to redeem Sartre's slighted concept of good faith, it must not be viewed interchangeably with authenticity. Further, in one of the earliest and most sustained studies of Sartre's notebooks for an ethics available in English, we can see how Sartre's posthumously published notes for an ethics of salvation confirm the differentiation between good faith and authenticity. The way out of Sartrean hell is authenticity, living with fidelity to our unjustifiable freedom and assuming responsibility for it. This distinction proves crucial for understanding Sartre's ethical philosophy and its relationship to his ontological analysis of human existence. Such a notion of authenticity is therefore quite different from what is often popularly misrepresented as a typically existentialist attitude, namely an absolute prioritization of individual spontaneity. On the contrary, a recognition of how our freedom interacts with our facticity exhibits the responsibility which we have to make proper choices. These are choices which are not trapped in bad faith but acknowledge both the radical character of human freedom and the concrete limitations within which that freedom operates. Through the practical consequences presented in Sartre's analysis, an existentialist ethics can be discerned that goes far beyond mere individual self-assertion. In order to ground itself, the self needs projects, which can be viewed as aspects of an individual's fundamental project, and motivated by a desire for being lying within the individual's consciousness. The source of this project is a spontaneous original choice that depends on the individual's freedom. However, self's choice may lead to a project of self-deception, such as bad faith, where one's own real nature as for itself is discarded to adopt that of the in itself. Our only way to escape self-deception is authenticity, that is, choosing in a way which reveals the existence of the for itself as both factual and transcendent. For Sartre, my proper exercise of freedom creates values that any other human being placed in my situation could experience. Therefore, each authentic project expresses a universal dimension in the singularity of a human life. If the picture which emerges from Sartre's examination of human relationships seems rather hopeless, it is because bad faith is omnipresent and inescapable. In fact, Sartre's philosophy has a very positive message, which is that we have infinite freedom and that this enables us to make authentic choices which escape from the grip of bad faith. To understand Sartre's notion of authenticity, therefore, requires that we first clarify his notion of freedom. For Sartre, each agent is endowed with unlimited freedom, though this statement may seem puzzling given the obvious limitations on every individual's freedom of choice. Clearly, physical and social constraints cannot be overlooked in the way in which we make choices. This is, however, a fact which Sartre accepts insofar as the for itself is facticity. And this does not lead to any contradiction insofar as freedom is not defined by an ability to act, but by the capacity to choose one's relationship to one's situation. With this notion of freedom as spontaneous choice, Sartre therefore has the elements required to define what it is to be an authentic human being. This consists in choosing in a way which reflects the nature of the for itself as both transcendence and facticity. This notion of authenticity, appears closely related to Heidegger's, since it involves a mode of being that exhibits a recognition that one is a being whose existence precedes essence. However, unlike Heidegger's, Sartre's conception has clear practical consequences for how one should live and act in concrete situations. For what is required of an authentic choice is that it involve a proper coordination of transcendence and facticity, and thus that it avoid the pitfalls of an uncoordinated expression of the desire for being. This amounts to properly grasping oneself as freedom and facticity simultaneously. Such a lack of proper coordination between transcendence and facticity constitutes bad faith, either at an individual or an interpersonal level. Authentic existence requires acknowledging both our radical freedom to transcend any given situation and the concrete factical constraints within which that transcendence operates. We cannot simply ignore our past, our social situation, our bodily limitations, but neither can we use these factors as excuses to deny our freedom to choose our response to these limitations. Sartre's existentialist understanding of what it is to be human can be summarized in his view that the underlying motivation for action is to be found in the nature of consciousness, which is a desire for being. It is up to each agent to exercise his freedom in such a way that he does not lose sight of his existence as a facticity, as well as a free human being. In so doing, he will come to understand more about the original choice which his whole life represents, and thus about the values that are thereby projected. Such an understanding is only obtained through living this particular life and avoiding the pitfalls of strategies of self-deceit such as bad faith. This authentic option for human life represents the realization of a universal in the singularity of a human life, making each authentic existence a model for what human existence can become. The relationship between authenticity and ethics in Sartre's philosophy is complex and has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. While Being and Nothingness promises an ethics in a famous footnote, Sartre never completed the systematic ethical treatise that many expected. However, his posthumously published Notebooks for an Ethics reveals his sustained engagement with ethical questions and his attempt to develop an existentialist ethics based on the concept of authenticity. This ethics would not be based on universal moral rules or principles, but on the authentic assumption of one's freedom and the recognition of the freedom of others. The political implications of Sartre's conception of authenticity would become increasingly important in his later work. If authentic existence requires the proper coordination of freedom and facticity, then social and political conditions that systematically distort or suppress human freedom become obstacles to authentic existence. This insight would lead Sartre to his later engagement with Marxism and his analysis of the social and economic conditions that make authentic existence possible or impossible for different groups of people. Authenticity is not simply an individual achievement, but requires social and political conditions that support rather than undermine the possibility of authentic choice for all human beings. This recognition would prove crucial to Sartre's development of a political philosophy capable of addressing concrete forms of oppression and liberation. Part 8. Freedom, Responsibility and Anguish. At the heart of Sartre's philosophy lies his conception of radical freedom, which represents perhaps his most distinctive and controversial contribution to 20th century thought. In later chapters of Being and Nothingness, he develops the basic ontological position in regard to free action, arguing that human consciousness is fundamentally free in ways that previous philosophy had not adequately recognized. His point is not, of course, to say we are free to do or achieve anything, or even to claim that we are free to project anything at all. The for itself is always in a factical situation with concrete limitations and constraints. Nonetheless, he asserts that the combination of the motives and ends we aspire to in relation to that facticity depend on an act of negation in relation to the given. As he puts it, action necessarily implies as its condition the recognition of a desideratum, that is, of an objective lack or, again, of a negatite. Even suffering in itself is not a sufficient motive to determine particular acts. Rather, it is the apprehension of the revolution as possible and as desired which gives to the worker's suffering its value as motive. A factual state, even poverty, does not determine consciousness to apprehend it as a lack. No factual state, whatever it may be, can cause consciousness to respond to it in any one way. Rather, we make a choice, usually pre-reflective, about the significance of that factual state for us, and the ends and motives that we adopt in relation to it. This radical conception of freedom brings with it an equally radical conception of responsibility. We are condemned to freedom of this ontological sort, with resulting anguish and responsibility for our individual situation, as well as for more collective situations of racism, oppression and colonialism. These are the themes for which Sartre became famous, especially after World War II, and existentialism is a humanism. The notion of being condemned to be free captures the paradoxical character of human existence. We do not choose to exist or to be free, but once we exist, we cannot escape the burden of choosing who we are and what we value. This freedom is not a gift but a burden, not a privilege but a responsibility that we cannot avoid or delegate to others. In Being and Nothingness, he provides various examples that are designed to make this quite radical philosophy of freedom plausible, including the hiker who gives in to their fatigue and collapses to the ground. Sartre says that a necessary condition for the hiker to give in to their fatigue, short of fainting, is that their fatigue goes from being experienced as simply part of the background to their activity, with their direct conscious attention focusing on something else, to being the direct focus of their attention, and thus becoming a motive for direct recognition of one's exhaustion and the potential action of collapsing to the ground. Although we are not necessarily reflectively aware of having made such a decision, things could have been otherwise, and thus Sartre contends we have made a choice. This example illustrates how even apparently involuntary actions involve a moment of choice about how to interpret and respond to our situation. Despite appearances, however, Sartre insists that his view is not a voluntarist or capricious account of freedom, but one that necessarily involves a situation and a context. His account of situated freedom in the chapter Freedom and Action affirms the inability to extricate intentions, ends, motives and reasons from the embodied context of the actor. As a synthetic whole, it is not merely freedom of intention or motive, and hence even consciousness, that Sartre affirms. Rather, our freedom is realized only in its projections and actions, and is nothing without such action. Freedom is not an abstract capacity that exists independently of concrete situations, but is always freedom in situation, freedom as a response to specific constraints and possibilities. The experience of anguish reveals to us the groundlessness of our existence and the weight of our freedom. Anguish is not fear of external objects, but the dizzying recognition that we must choose who we are at every moment without ultimate foundation or guarantee. It is the effective revelation of our freedom, the emotional recognition that we are responsible for our choices and their consequences. Anguish shows us that we could always act otherwise than we do, that our values and commitments are not given but chosen, that there is no ultimate foundation for our moral and existential decisions. In the famous example of vertigo, standing at the edge of a precipice, we experience anguish not because we fear that we will fall, but because we recognize that we could choose to jump. This recognition reveals the radical character of our freedom and the corresponding weight of our responsibility. The temporal structure of human existence is crucial to understanding Sartre's conception of freedom and responsibility. We are not simply our past and our objective attributes in accord with some sort of principle of identity, because we are also our projects, and these are intrinsically future-oriented. This temporal structure means that we are always more than our past accomplishments and present situation, always open to future possibilities that can transform the meaning of our past and present. However, this does not mean that the past is irrelevant to our present choices. We are our past in the mode of no longer being it, which means that our past provides the factical context within which our freedom operates, but does not determine the choices we make in response to that context. Since the force of compulsion in my past is borrowed from my free, reflecting choice and from the very power which this choice has given itself, it is impossible to determine a priori the compelling power of a past. Past events bear no other meaning than the one given by a subject, in agreement with the free project that orients his or her existence towards the future. This means that we are responsible not only for our present choices, but also for the meaning we give to our past and the way we project ourselves toward the future. We choose not only what to do, but also how to interpret what we have done and how to understand the significance of our actions for our ongoing projects of self-creation. The social and political implications of this conception of freedom and responsibility are profound and would become increasingly important in Sartre's later work. If we are radically free and responsible, then we cannot use social conditions, cultural background, or psychological makeup as excuses for our actions. However, this does not mean that social conditions are irrelevant to the exercise of freedom. Rather, it means that we are responsible for our response to social conditions, including our response to conditions of oppression and domination. This insight would lead Sartre to his later analysis of how social and economic conditions can systematically distort the exercise of freedom while never eliminating the possibility of free choice and resistance. The burden of freedom cannot be escaped, but the conditions under which freedom operates can be transformed through collective action, aimed at creating more authentic possibilities for human existence. Part 9. Existential Psychoanalysis and the Fundamental Project. Sartre's radical criticism of Freud's theory of the unconscious is not his last word on psychoanalysis, but leads to his development of an alternative approach that he calls existential psychoanalysis. In the last chapters of Being and Nothingness, Sartre presents his own conception of an existential psychoanalysis, drawing on some insights from his attempt to account for Emperor Wilhelm II as a human reality in the 14th notebook from his war diaries. This existential version of psychoanalysis is claimed to be compatible with Sartre's rejection of the unconscious, and is expected to achieve a psychoanalysis of consciousness, allowing us to understand one's existence in light of their fundamental free choice of themselves. The very idea of a psychoanalysis oriented towards the study of consciousness rather than the unconscious seems paradoxical. A paradox increased by Sartre's efforts to highlight the fundamental differences that oppose his own version of psychoanalysis to Freud's. Sartre contends that Freud's empirical psychoanalysis is based on the hypothesis of the existence of an unconscious psyche, which on principle escapes the intuition of the subject. By contrast, Sartre's own existential psychoanalysis aims to remain faithful to one of the earliest claims of Husserl's phenomenology, that all psychic acts are coextensive with consciousness. For Sartre, however, the basic motivation for rejecting Freud's hypothesis is less an inheritance of Brentano's descriptive psychology than a consequence of Sartre's fundamental critique of determinism, applied to the naturalist presuppositions of empirical psychoanalysis and the particular kind of determinism that it involves. In agreement with Freud, Sartre holds that psychic life remains inevitably opaque and at least somewhat impenetrable to us. He also stresses that the philosophical understanding of human reality requires a method for investigating the meaning of psychic facts. But Sartre denies that the methods and causal laws of the natural sciences are of any help in that respect. The human psyche cannot be fully analyzed and explained as a mere result of external constraints acting like physical forces or natural causes. The for itself, being always what it is not and not what it is, remains free whatever the external and social constraints. Sartre is consequently bound to reject any emphasis on the causal impact of the past upon the present, which he argues is the basic methodological framework of empirical psychoanalysis. That does not mean that past psychic or physical facts have no impact on one's existence whatsoever. Rather, Sartre contends that the impact of past events is determined in relation to one's present choice, and understood as the consequence of the power invested in this free choice. As he puts it, since the force of compulsion in my past is borrowed from my free, reflecting choice and from the very power which this choice has given itself, it is impossible to determine a priori the compelling power of a past. Past events bear no other meaning than the one given by a subject, in agreement with the free project that orients his or her existence towards the future. Conversely, determinist explanations that construe one's present as a mere consequence of the past proceed from a kind of self-delusion that operates by concealing one's free project and thus contributes to the obliteration of responsibility. Sartre hence seeks to redefine the scope of psychoanalysis. Rather than a proper explanation of human behavior that relies on the identification of the laws of its causation, psychoanalysis consists in understanding the meaning of our conducts in light of one's project of existence and free choice. One might wonder then why we need any such psychoanalysis if the existential project that constitutes its object is freely chosen by the subject. Sartre addresses this objection in Being and Nothingness, claiming that if the fundamental project is fully experienced by the subject and hence wholly conscious, that certainly does not mean that it must by the same token be known by him. Quite the contrary. What Freud calls the unconscious must be redescribed as the paradoxical entanglement of a total absence of knowledge, combined with a true understanding of oneself. The legitimacy of Sartre's existential psychoanalysis of consciousness lies in its ability to unveil the original project according to which one chooses, more or less obscurely, to develop the fundamental orientations of their existence. According to Sartre, analyzing a human subject and understanding the meaning that orients their existence as a whole requires that we grasp the specific kind of unity that lies behind their various attitudes and conducts. This unity can only appear once we discover the synthetic principle of unification or totalization that commands the whole of their behaviors. Sartre understands this totalization as an ongoing process that covers the entire course of one's existence, a process which is constantly reassumed so as to integrate the new developments of this existence. For this reason, this never-ending process of totalization cannot be fully self-conscious or the object of reflective self-knowledge. The synthetic principle that makes this totalization possible is identified by Sartre in terms of fundamental choice. Existential psychoanalysis describes human subjects as synthetic totalities in which every attitude, conduct or behavior finds its meaning in relation to the unity of a primary choice, which all of the subject's behavior expresses in its own way. All human behavior can thus be described as a secondary particularization of a fundamental project which expresses the subject's free choice and conditions the intelligibility of their actions. On the basis of his diagnosis of Baudelaire's existential project, for instance, Sartre goes as far as to claim that he is prepared to wager that he preferred meats cooked in sauces to grills, preserves to fresh vegetables. Sartre legitimates such a daring statement by showing its logical connection to Baudelaire's irresistible hatred for nature, from which his gastronomic preferences must derive, and which Sartre identifies as the expression of the initial free choice of himself that commands the whole of the French poet Maudy's existence. In Sartre's words, he chose to exist for himself as he was for others. He wanted his freedom to appear to himself like a nature, and he wanted this nature which others discovered in him to appear to them like the very emanation of his freedom. From that point, everything becomes clear. We should look in vain for a single circumstance for which he was not fully and consciously responsible. Every event was a reflection of that indecomposable totality which he was from the first to the last day of his life. Baudelaire's choice of himself both accounts for the subject's freedom insofar as it has been freely accepted as the subject's own project of existence, and exerts a constraint on particular behaviours and attitudes towards the world, so that he is bound to act and behave in a way that must be compatible with that choice. Although absolutely free, such an initial choice takes the shape and the meaning of an inescapable and relentless destiny, a destiny in which one's sense of freedom and their inability to act in any other way than they actually did come to merge perfectly. The free choice which a man makes of himself is completely identified with what is called his destiny. In the years following the publication of Being and Nothingness, Sartre refines this original conception of existential psychoanalysis. He applies it methodically to the biographical analysis of a series of major French writers, Baudelaire first, then Mallarmé, Jean Genet, Flaubert and himself in words, warning against the dangers of all kinds of determinist interpretations, from the constitution of psychological types to materialist explanations inherited from Marxian historical analyses. Sartre's analyses become more subtle over time, as he substitutes fine-grained descriptions of the concrete constraints that frame and shape the limits of human lives to the strongly metaphysical theses on freedom that he was first tempted to apply indistinctly to each of these writers. Accordingly, existential psychoanalysis plays a central role in the development of Sartre's thought from the early 40s up to his last published work on Flaubert, allowing him to unify and articulate two fundamental threads of his philosophical thinking: his ontological analysis of the absolute freedom of the for itself in being and nothingness, and his later attempt to take into consideration the social, historical and political factors that are inevitably involved in the determination of one's free choice of their own existence. Part 10. The Turn Toward Politics. Critique of Dialectical Reason. By the 1950s, Sartre had become convinced that his early existentialist philosophy needed to be integrated with a social and political analysis capable of addressing the concrete historical conditions within which human freedom operates. While Search for a Method had been published earlier, it is not until 1960 that Sartre completed the first volume, Theory of Practical Ensembles, of what is his final systematic work of philosophy, Critique of Dialectical Reason. The second volume, The Intelligibility of History, was published posthumously in French in 1985. It would be 1991 before both volumes were to be available in English, which goes some of the way towards explaining their subsequent neglect. It is also a book that rivals Being and Nothingness for difficulty, even if some of its goals and ambitions can be expressed straightforwardly enough. Never a member of the French Communist Party, Sartre nonetheless begins by laying his Marxist cards on the table. We were convinced at one and the same time that historical materialism furnished the only valid interpretation of history, and that existentialism remained the only concrete approach to reality. Critique offers a systematic attempt to justify these two perspectives and render them compatible. In broad terms, some of the main steps needed to effect such a synthesis are clear, most notably to deny or limit strong structuralist and determinist versions of Marxism. Borrowing some themes from Merleau-Ponty's Humanism and Terror, Sartre maintained that any genuinely dialectical method refuses to reduce. It refuses scientific and economic determinism that treats humans as things, contrary to reductive versions of Marxism. He pithily puts his objection to such explanations in terms of what we might today call the genetic fallacy. Sartre says, Valéry is a petit bourgeois intellectual, no doubt about it, but not every petit bourgeois intellectual is Valéry. The heuristic inadequacy of contemporary Marxism is contained in these two sentences. Moreover, for Sartre, class struggle is not the only factor that determines and orients history and the field of possibilities. There is human choice and commitment in class formation that is equally fundamental. The way in which this plays out in Critique is through an emphasis on praxis rather than consciousness, which is also characteristic of his existential psychoanalytic work of the prior decade. Without being able to adequately summarize the vast critique here, one of the book's core conceptual innovations is the idea of the Practico-Inert. Sartre defines this as the activity of others insofar as it is sustained and diverted by inorganic inertia. The concept is intended to capture the forms of social and historical sedimentation that had only minimally featured in Being and Nothingness. It is the reign of necessity, the domain in which inorganic materiality envelops human multiplicity and transforms the producer into its product. For Sartre, the Practico-Inert is the negation of humanity. Any reaffirmation of humanity in which genuine freedom resides must take the form of the negation of this negation. Negation is productive here, as it also was in Being and Nothingness. For Sartre, then, there are two fundamental kinds of social reality. A positive one, in which an active group constitutes the common field, and a negative one in which individuals are effectively separated from each other, even though they appear united in a practico-inert field. In the practico-inert field, relations are typified by what Sartre calls seriality, like a number, or a worker in a factory who is allocated to a place within a given system that is indifferent to the individual. Sartre's prime example of this is of waiting for a bus or streetcar on the way to work. If the people involved do not know each other reasonably well, there is likely to be a kind of anonymity to such experiences in which individuals are substitutable for each other in relation to this imminent bus, and their relations are organized around functional need. If the bus is late, or if there are too many people on it, however, those who are waiting go from being indifferent and anonymous to becoming competitors and rivals. In a related spirit, Sartre also discusses the serial unity of the TV-watching public, of the popular music charts, bourgeois property and petty racism and stereotyping as well. These collective objects keep serial individuals apart from one another under the pretext of unifying them. Sartre thus appears to accept a version of the Marxian theses concerning commodity fetishism. This competitive or antagonistic dimension of the Practico-Inert is amplified in situations of material scarcity. This kind of seriality is argued to be the basic type of sociality, thus transforming the focus on dyadic consciousness of being and nothingness. In the critique, otherness becomes produced not simply through the look that Sartre had previously described as the original meaning of being for others, but through the sedimentation of social processes and through practico-inert mediation. Society produces in us serial behaviour, serial feelings, serial thoughts and passive activity, where events and history are conceived as external occurrences that befall us, and we feel compelled by the force of circumstance, or monstrous forces, as Sartre puts it. It is the practico-inert, modified by material and economic scarcity, which turns us into conflictual competitors and alienates us from each other and ourselves. Only an end to both material scarcity and the alienating mediation of the practico-inert will allow for the actualization of socialism. While Sartre is pessimistic about the prospects for any sort of permanent revolution of society, he maintains that we get a fleeting glimpse of this unalienated condition in the experience of the group infusion. This occurs when the members of a group relate to each other through praxis and in a particular way. The group infusion is not a collective à la the practico-inert, but a social whole that spontaneously forms as a plurality of serial individuals respond to some danger, pressing situation, or to the likelihood of a collective reaction to their stance. We could consider what happens when an individual acts so as to make manifest this serial otherness, like Rosa Parks, when she refused to give up her seat, and thus drew attention to the specific nature of the colonialist seriality at the heart of many states in the USA. This sometimes creates a rupture, and others might follow. Sartre's own prime example is of a crowd of workers who were fleeing during the French Revolution in 1789. At some point the workers stopped fleeing, turned around and reversed direction, suddenly energized alongside each other by their practical awareness that they were doing something together. For this kind of fusion to happen, it must fulfill 4 key conditions for genuine reciprocity. That the other be a means to the exact degree that I am a means myself. That is, that he be the means towards a transcendent goal and not my means. That I recognize the other as praxis at the same time as I integrate him into my totalizing project, that I recognize his movement towards his own ends in the very movement by which I project myself towards mine, that I discover myself as an object and instrument of his own ends by the same act that makes him an object and instrument of mine. Sartre calls the resurrection of this freedom an apocalypse, indicating that it is an unforeseen and potentially revolutionary event that happens when serial abuse and exploitation can no longer be tolerated. The group infusion has a maximum of praxis and a minimum of inertia, but serial sociality has the reverse. Unfortunately, Sartre insists that this group infusion is destined to meet with what he calls an ontological check, in the form of the institution, which cannot be escaped as some versions of anarchism and Marxism might hope. The group relapses into seriality when groups are formalized into hierarchical institutional structures. Serial otherness comes to implicate itself in interpersonal relations in at least three ways in the institution: sovereignty, authority, and bureaucracy. From the co-sovereignty of the group in fusion, someone inevitably becomes sovereign in any new social order. Similarly, a command-obedience relation comes about in institutions to greater and lesser extents, and there will be exhortations to company loyalty, to do one's duty, and so forth. Bureaucratic rules and regulation also inevitably follow, partly as a reaction to fear of sovereignty, and this installs what Sartre calls vertical otherness, top-down hierarchies as opposed to the horizontal and immanent organization of the group in fusion. As such, the revolutionary force of the group in fusion is necessarily subject to mediation by the Practico-Inert, as well as the problems associated with institutionality just described. Although it is still structured through a series of oppositions, the critique delivers a sophisticated social ontology that both addresses some weaknesses in Sartre's earlier work and unifies the social and political reflections of much of his later work. Part 11. Marxism and the Practico-Inert. Sartre's engagement with Marxism in the critique of dialectical reason represents a fundamental development of his philosophical system, extending his analysis of individual consciousness into the realm of social and economic structures. The central problematic of Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, and more broadly of his entire critical project after 1960, is how to reconcile existentialism with Marxism. How can we resolve the contradiction between, on the one hand, a Marxist philosophy that identifies in the contradictions between modes of production and social relations the motor of human action and revolution, and on the other hand, an existentialist philosophy that was grounded on a radical freedom to act? The answer, he suggests, is that in his critique, Sartre does away with the teleology that characterizes Marxist history, rejects the positivism that infuses scientific Marxism, and opposes all forms of mechanical dialectical thought. To be sure, Sartre retains significant elements of Marxism. He maintains that human beings are shaped by their historical situation, and that the tension between economic modes of production and social relations is central to that historical situation. He retains a strong commitment to contradiction and conflict as what motivates human action. And he preserves in his historical analysis the fundamental Marxist categories of the bourgeoisie, working class and proletariat. However, he infuses his analysis with a phenomenology and psychology of individual action that takes into account human needs, frustrations and ambitions. Needs, motives, events, situation, scarcity, projects. These are the words that permeate Sartre's style of existential Marxism. Man defines himself by his project. He declares deep into the search for a method, echoing his writings on existentialism. The concept of the project is at the heart of Sartre's philosophy. Human beings form projects in response to their felt needs in a world marked by scarcity. And their projects, although they may well be situated and even shaped by historical conditions, remain individual projects of resistance to oppression, of satisfying needs, of achieving forms of liberation. Sartre infuses his analyses of individual human action with psychoanalysis, demonstrating through the example of the young Gustave Flaubert the importance of focusing on childhood, parents, siblings, all of the Freudian elements. The result is that Sartre constantly tries to complexify dialectical reason, to enrich it with psychoanalysis and cultural analysis, and to introduce the human being, and not just groups such as the working class or the proletariat, back into the analysis. This is captured well in certain passages where Sartre spells out his own vision of history. Men make their history on the basis of real prior conditions, among which we would include acquired characteristics, distortions imposed by the mode of work and of life, alienation and so forth. But it is the men who make it, and not the prior conditions. To be sure, these conditions exist, and it is they alone, which can furnish a direction and a material reality to the changes which are in preparation. But the movement of human praxis goes beyond them while conserving them. Sartre's critique of dialectical reason represents one of the most sustained efforts to integrate, on the one hand, a materialist critical theory attuned to the historical and material conditions of human existence, and on the other hand, an existentialist philosophy that insists on the irreducible freedom and responsibility of individual human beings. In his critique of dialectical reason, Sartre recasts Marx's notion of alienation as our experience of the Practico-Inert. Alienation, Sartre suggests, is our experience of the materialized result. It is no longer the positive moment in which one does, but the negative moment in which one is produced in passivity by what the Practico-Inert ensemble makes out of what one has just made. If we say the worker produces capital, then that is simply a shorthand way of saying what Sartre has just said. What one has just made, the product of one's labour, becomes capital, a commodity that belongs to the capitalist, thanks to capital, thanks to a Practico-Inert ensemble which is the accumulation of capital and the system bound up with it. As a wage labourer, the worker is a worked thing, and as capital, worked matter is the inert meaning of the worker. Exigency becomes a crucial category of the critique as Sartre's way of characterizing the way we experience and respond to the force of materiality, of the Practico-Inert, or to what he calls the anti-dialectic, that is, that huge sector of human experience sandwiched between individual action, my freedom as a real agent, and the action of groups, which of course is sustained by individuals and by their freedom as practical organisms, since the group is not an organism of any sort. The anti-dialectic is replete with monstrous forces. Close to 200 pages of the first volume of the Critique expound Sartre's theory of worked matter, in which 4 ideas or sets of ideas are specially worth noting. First, the analysis of how human labour becomes embedded in material objects that then constrain future human action. Second, the examination of how scarcity functions as a fundamental condition that shapes human relationships and social organisation. Third, the investigation of how institutions emerge from human praxis but then develop their own inertia that limits human freedom. And fourth, the exploration of how collective action can temporarily overcome the constraints of the Practico-Inert through the formation of groups in fusion. According to Sartre, mainstream Marxism had forgotten the dialectical interplay between agency and structure, favouring circumstances already existing over people making their own histories. It had become boringly determinist as a result. And while some Marxists celebrated the working class as a harbinger of revolutionary change, Sartre disagreed. As he observed its development in France, the working class was merely a sociological category or passive collective, like strangers waiting for a bus or shoppers in a supermarket. Collectives are an impoverished type of unity consisting of isolated individuals, each pursuing his or her own interests. They cannot work together to overcome circumstances already given. What Sartre calls the Practico-Inert structures their collective behaviour. This term literally means impotent action or inactive practice, and arises from the false naturalization of prevailing institutions. The Practico-Inert represents all those social structures, economic systems, technological arrangements and cultural formations that, while originally created by human praxis, have taken on a life of their own and now constrain human action in ways that appear natural and inevitable. These structures include not only economic institutions like markets and factories, but also cultural phenomena like language, artistic traditions and systems of belief. The crucial point is that these structures, while originally products of human freedom and creativity, become sedimentated into forms that appear to have their own independent existence and power. They then shape human behavior and experience in ways that tend to reproduce the conditions that created them, creating what Sartre calls a circle of alienation, in which human beings become estranged from their own creative powers. However, Sartre's analysis of the Practico-Inert is not entirely pessimistic. While these structures do constrain human action and reproduce forms of alienation, they also provide the material conditions within which human freedom can operate. The key is understanding how human praxis can work both with and against the Practico-Inert to create new forms of social organization that enhance rather than diminish human freedom. This requires what Sartre calls a regressive-progressive method that traces both the sedimentation of past praxis into present structures and the possibilities for future transformation contained within those structures. The goal is not to escape the Practico-Inert, which is impossible, but to transform it in directions that support, rather than undermine, authentic human existence. This transformation requires collective action that can overcome the serialization and atomization characteristic of life under the domination of the Practico-Inert. Part 12. Anti-Colonialism and Political Engagement. Sartre's political philosophy extended far beyond abstract theory to concrete engagement with the major issues of his time, particularly the struggles against colonialism and racism that dominated the post-war period. Although it is not possible to address all of Sartre's rich and varied contributions to ethics and politics, the key ideas about race and anti-colonialism were important themes in his post-Being and Nothingness work and continue to resonate with contemporary movements for social justice. Sartre was generally stridently anti-colonialist, perhaps even advocating a multiculturalism avant la lettre, and his books and more journalistic writings typically call out what he saw as the bad faith of many French and European citizens in their relationship to colonial oppression. The issue of race was part of Sartre's French intellectual scene, and Sartre himself played a major role in facilitating debates about the intersection of philosophy and race, and colonialism and multiculturalism, not only regarding the French, Algerian and African colonies, but also Vietnam. Initially, at least, Sartre's arguments here typically drew on and extended some of the categories deployed in Being and Nothingness. There is an obvious sense in which a critique of racism automatically ensues from Sartrean existentialism. Racism is a form of bad faith for Sartre, since it typically, perhaps necessarily, involves believing in essences or types, and indeed constructing essences and types. His notebooks suggest that all oppression rests on bad faith. In racism, in particular, there is an infernal circle of irresponsible responsibility, of culpable ignorance and ignorance, which is knowledge, as well as what Sartre calls passive complicity. Many of us, or Sartre's own French society, may not obviously be bigots, but we sustain a system that is objectively unjust through our choices and sometimes willful ignorance. In relation to colonialism, Sartre likewise contends that we have all profited from colonialist exploitation and sustained its systems, even if we are not ourselves a settler. This is also the key argument of Anti-Semite and the Jew, composed very quickly in 1944 and without much detailed knowledge of Judaism, but with more direct knowledge of the sort of passive anti-Semitism of many French citizens. The text was written following the Dreyfus affair and before all of the horrors of the Holocaust were widely known. Sartre was aiming to understand and critique the situation he observed around him, in which the imminent return of the French Jews exiled by the Nazis was not unambiguously welcomed by all. The book is perceptive about its prime targets, the explicit or implicit anti-Semite, who defines the real Frenchman by excluding others, notably the Jew. Now, of course, few of his contemporaries would admit to being anti-Semites, just as few would admit to being racist. But there are patterns of bad faith that Sartre thinks are clear. We participate in social systems that force the dilemma of authenticity or inauthenticity upon the Jew, asking them to choose between their concrete practical identities, religious and cultural, and more universal ascriptions, liberty and so forth, in a way that cannot be readily navigated within the terms of the debate. Sartre consistently ascribes responsibility to collectives here, even if those collectives are ultimately sustained by individual decisions and choices. For him, it's not just the assassins say, nor just Eichmann and the Nazi regime who are held responsible. Rather, these more obviously egregious activities were sustained by their society and the individuals in it, through culpable ignorance and patterns of bad faith. Sartre also addressed the negritude movement in his preface to Black Orpheus, an anthology of negritude poetry. He called for an anti-racist racism and saw himself as resolutely on the side of the negritude movement, but he also envisaged such interventions as a step towards ultimately revealing the category of race itself as an example of bad faith. Here the reception from Frantz Fanon and others was mixed. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon argues this effectively undermined his own lived experience and its power. Sartre continued to address colonialism and racism in subsequent work, effecting a rapprochement of sorts with Fanon that culminated in his introduction to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, where also Sartre appears to endorse a counter-violence. His existential humanism grounded his critique of the capitalist and colonialist systems. He wrote that the meanness is in the system, a claim that resonated with liberation movements then and now. But his properly existentialist understanding of that phrase, respecting the ethical primacy of free organic praxis, requires that he qualify the remark with "not entirely," for whatever system he speaks of rides on the backs of responsible individuals, alone or more likely in social wholes, for whom moral responsibility can and should be ascribed. This may serve as his lesson to the ontology and the ethics of race relations in the 21st century. His appeal for violence to counter the inherent violence of the colonial system in Algeria reached hyperbolic proportions in his prefatory essay to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Although we have not given much attention to Sartre's literary and artistic productions since his analysis of imagination and literature in his early work, he continued to produce artistic work of political significance throughout his career. Continuous with insights from his What is Literature, Sartre argues that in a society that remains unjust and dominated by oppression, the prose writer, if not the poet, must combat this violence by jolting the reader and audience from their complacency rather than simply be concerned with art for its own sake. His literary works, hence, are typically both philosophical and political. Although the number of these works diminished over time, there is still a powerful literary exploration of the philosophical and political themes of the critique in the play, The Condemned of Altona. The breadth and consistency of Sartre's anti-colonial stance reflects his deeper philosophical commitment to human freedom, and the recognition that oppression anywhere threatens freedom everywhere. His analysis of colonialism as a system of bad faith that dehumanizes both oppressor and oppressed provides a philosophical framework for understanding how systems of domination operate through the internalization of oppressive ideologies. The colonized subject is forced to choose between rejecting their cultural identity in favor of the colonizer's values or maintaining their cultural identity at the cost of social and economic marginalization. This impossible choice exemplifies what Sartre sees as the fundamental violence of colonial systems. They structure situations in such a way that authentic choice becomes extremely difficult or impossible. However, Sartre's analysis also points toward possibilities of liberation through collective action and the formation of groups in fusion that can challenge colonial domination. His support for various liberation movements from Algeria to Vietnam to Cuba reflects his belief that oppressed peoples have not only the right, but the responsibility to resist their oppression through whatever means necessary, including violence when other means have been exhausted. This position was controversial even among his supporters, but Sartre argued that the violence of the oppressed is always a response to the prior and more fundamental violence of the oppressive system. Liberation movements represent attempts to break out of the serial isolation imposed by colonial domination and to create new forms of collective action based on shared recognition of common interests and values. These movements point toward the possibility of creating social conditions that support rather than undermine authentic human existence for all people, regardless of their racial, cultural, or national background. Part 13. Literature and Philosophy, the Unity of Sartre's Vision. Sartre was much more than just a traditional academic philosopher, and this begins to explain his extraordinary renown and lasting influence. He also wrote highly influential works of literature, inflected by philosophical concerns like Nausea, the Roads to Freedom trilogy, and plays like No Exit, Flies and Dirty Hands, to name just a few. He founded and co-edited Les Temps Modernes and mobilized various forms of political protest and action, becoming a celebrity and public intellectual par excellence, especially in the period after liberation through to the early 1960s. Responding to some calls to prosecute Sartre for civil disobedience, the then French President Charles de Gaulle replied that, "You don't arrest Voltaire," indicating the extraordinary cultural significance that Sartre had achieved through his integration of philosophical rigor with literary creativity and political engagement. For Sartre, literature was not separate from philosophy, but another means of exploring the human condition with equal rigor and potentially greater impact. This original conception of the nature of the work of art dominates Sartre's critical approach to literature in the many essays he dedicates to the art of the novel, including his critical analyses of recent writers' novels in the 30s, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Hemingway, Mariac and others, and the publication in the late 40s of his own summative view, What is Literature? In a series of articles gathered in the first volume of his Situations, Sartre defends a strong version of literary realism that can, somewhat paradoxically, be read as a consequence of his theory of the irreality of the work of art. If imagination projects the spectator within the imaginary world created by the artist, then the success of the artistic process is proportional to the capacity of the artwork to let the spectator experience it as a reality of its own, giving rise to a full-fledged world. Sartre applies in particular this analysis to novels, which must aim, according to him, at immersing the reader within the fictional world they depict, so as to make her experience the events and adventures of the characters as if she was living them in first person. The complete absorption of the reader within the imaginary world created by the novelist must ultimately recreate the particular feel of reality that defines Sartre's phenomenological kind of literary realism, which became highly influential over the following decades in French literature. The reader must be able to experience the actions of the characters of the novel as if they did not result from the imagination of the novelist, but proceeded from the character's own freedom. And Sartre goes as far as to claim that this radical, spellbinding quality of literary fiction defines the touchstone of the art of the novel. This original version of literary realism is intrinsically tied to the question of freedom, and opposed to the idea according to which realist literature is expected to provide a mere description of reality as it is. In What is Literature, Sartre describes the task of the novelist as that of disclosing the world as if it arose from human freedom, rather than from a deterministic chain of causes and consequences. The author's art consists in obliging her reader to create what she discloses, and so to share with the writer the responsibility and freedom involved in the act of literary creation. In order for the world of the novel to offer its maximum density, the disclosure creation by which the reader discovers it must also be an imaginary engagement in the action. In other words, the more disposed one is to change it, the more alive it will be. The conception of the writer's engagement that resulted from these analyses constitutes probably the most well-known aspect of Sartre's relation to literature. The writer only has one topic: freedom. This analysis of the role of imaginative creations of art can also help us to understand the role of philosophy within his own novels, particularly in Nausea, a novel which Sartre began as he was studying Husserl in Berlin. In this novel, Sartre's pre-phenomenological interest for the irreducibility of contingency intersects with his newly acquired competencies in phenomenological analyses, making Nausea a beautifully illustrated expression of the metaphysical register Sartre gave to Husserl's conception of intentionality. The feeling of nausea that Roquentin, the main character of Sartre's novel, famously experienced in a public garden while obsessively watching a chestnut tree, accounts for his sensitivity to the absolute lack of necessity of whatever exists. Sartre understands this radical absence of necessity as the expression of the fundamental contingency of being. Roquentin's traumatic moment of realization that there is absolutely no reason for the existence of all that exists illustrates the intuition that motivated Sartre's philosophical thinking since the very beginning of his intellectual career, as Simone de Beauvoir recalls. It constitutes the metaphysical background of his interpretation of intentionality, which he would come to develop and systematize in the early dense parts of being and nothingness. While the experience of nausea when confronting the contingency of the chestnut tree doesn't give us conceptual knowledge, it involves a form of non-conceptual ontological awareness that is of a fundamentally different order to, and cannot be derived from, our conceptual understanding and knowledge of brute existence. The integration of literature and philosophy in Sartre's work reflects his conviction that both forms of expression are necessary for adequately capturing the full complexity of human existence. Philosophy provides the conceptual rigor and systematic analysis needed to understand the structures of consciousness, freedom, and social reality, while literature provides the imaginative concreteness needed to show how these structures operate in particular situations and individual lives. Neither approach alone is sufficient for understanding the human condition, Both are needed to provide a complete account that does justice to both the universal structures of human existence and the irreducible particularity of individual experience. This integration of philosophical analysis with literary creation would prove influential for subsequent generations of writers and philosophers, particularly in France, but also internationally. The plays that Sartre wrote throughout his career provide particularly powerful examples of how philosophical insights can be given dramatic form without sacrificing either philosophical rigor or artistic effectiveness. No Exit, with its famous declaration that hell is other people, dramatizes the analysis of intersubjectivity developed in being and nothingness, while creating a theatrical experience that makes these philosophical insights immediately accessible to audiences. The Flies reworks the Orestes myth to explore themes of freedom, responsibility and political resistance that were central to Sartre's engagement with the French resistance during World War II. Dirty Hands examines the ethical dilemmas faced by political activists, who must choose between moral purity and political effectiveness, themes that would become central to Sartre's later political philosophy. These plays demonstrate how philosophical ideas can be given concrete dramatic form without losing their intellectual content or their relevance to pressing political and ethical questions. The biographical works that Sartre produced throughout his career, from his studies of Baudelaire and Jean Genet to his massive analysis of Flaubert in The Family Idiot, represent another form of integration between philosophical analysis and literary creation. These works applied the method of existential psychoanalysis to understand how particular individuals have chosen themselves in response to their historical situations, revealing both the universal structures of human existence and the irreducible particularity of individual lives. They demonstrate how philosophical concepts can be used to illuminate individual cases, while these individual cases provide concrete examples that test and refine philosophical understanding. The progressive-regressive method that Sartre develops in these biographical studies would prove influential for subsequent work in biography, psychology, and social history, showing how individual lives can be understood in their full complexity without reducing them to either abstract philosophical categories or mere empirical data. Part 14. Contemporary Relevance and Lasting Impact. As Sartrean existentialism frees itself from the limitations of its post-war adolescence and shows its mature psychological, ontological and ethical face to the new century, it enters with adult standing into the ongoing conversation that we call Western philosophy. Its relevance remains as actual today as does the human condition that it describes and analyses, providing resources for thinking about contemporary challenges that earlier philosophical traditions have struggled to address adequately. The combination of rigorous philosophical analysis with concrete engagement with historical and political realities makes Sartre's work particularly relevant to an era that increasingly demands that philosophy demonstrate its practical relevance to pressing social and political issues. Emphasis on an ethics of responsibility, in contrast to one of rules, principles or values in recent years, has led to a widespread interest in the work of Levinas as a necessary complement to so-called postmodern ethics. But Sartrean authenticity is equally relevant in this regard, as Charles Taylor and others have pointed out, and its location within a mundane ontology may resonate better with philosophers of a more secular bent. Next, the recent revival of the understanding of philosophy as a way of life, as distinct from an academic discipline focused on epistemology or more recently on the philosophy of language, while renewing an interest in Hellenistic ethics as well as in various forms of spirituality confined in Sartrean existentialism, forms of care of the self that invite fruitful conversation with contemporary ethics, aesthetics and politics without devolving into moralism, aestheticism or fanaticism. His existential humanism grounded his critique of the capitalist and colonialist systems. He wrote that the meanness is in the system, a claim that resonated with liberation movements then and now. But his properly existentialist understanding of that phrase, respecting the ethical primacy of free organic praxis, requires that he qualify the remark with not entirely. For whatever system he speaks of rides on the backs of responsible individuals, alone or more likely in social wholes, for whom moral responsibility can and should be ascribed. This may serve as his lesson to the ontology and the ethics of race relations in the 21st century, providing a framework for understanding how systemic oppression operates through individual choices while maintaining that those choices remain genuine choices for which individuals bear responsibility. His appeal for violence to counter the inherent violence of the colonial system in Algeria reached hyperbolic proportions in his prefatory essay to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, but his analysis of the relationship between individual responsibility and systemic oppression continues to inform contemporary debates about racism, economic inequality and social justice. Of the other topics in current philosophical discussions to which Sartre offers relevant remarks, feminism deserves special mention. While Sartre's own writings on gender and sexuality were limited and sometimes problematic by contemporary standards, his analysis of how oppression operates through the internalization of oppressive ideologies and the creation of situations that make authentic choice difficult or impossible has proven influential for feminist theory. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, written in close collaboration with Sartre, applies existentialist insights to the analysis of women's oppression in ways that continue to influence contemporary feminist philosophy and political activism. The existentialist emphasis on the social construction of identity, the importance of recognizing and resisting bad faith, and the possibility of creating new forms of authentic existence through collective action provides resources for feminist theory that complement other approaches to understanding gender oppression and liberation. We do think, however, that it is arguable, with the benefit of hindsight, that some of Sartre's interventions are prescient rather than outmoded remnants of the 19th century, as Michel Foucault once characterized them. They certainly presage issues that are in the foreground today, concerning class, race and gender, and his analysis of how oppression operates through the creation of false choices and the internalization of oppressive ideologies remains relevant to contemporary struggles for social justice. That doesn't mean that Sartre got it all correct, of course, whatever that might mean in regard to the complex realities of socio-political life. Indeed, if one is to take a stand on so many of the major socio-political issues of one's time, as Sartre did, it is inevitable that history will not look kindly on them all. Sartre's life and writings hence present a complex and difficult interpretive task, but they remain a powerful provocation for thought and action today. The psychological insights developed in Sartre's existential psychoanalysis continue to offer alternatives to both traditional psychoanalytic approaches and contemporary cognitive and behavioral approaches to understanding human psychology. His emphasis on understanding individuals in terms of their fundamental projects and free choices, rather than as products of unconscious drives or behavioral conditioning, provides resources for therapeutic approaches that emphasize human agency and responsibility while remaining sensitive to the social and historical conditions that shape individual experience. The progressive-regressive method, developed in his biographical studies, offers a model for understanding individual development that integrates psychological, social, and historical analysis in ways that avoid both reductive individualism and deterministic social explanations. The political insights developed in the critique of dialectical reason continue to offer resources for understanding contemporary social movements and political struggles. His analysis of seriality and the Practico-Inert provides conceptual tools for understanding how contemporary forms of social media and consumer culture create new forms of isolation and alienation while appearing to connect people to each other and to shared values. His analysis of groups in fusion offers insights into how social movements contemporarily overcome these forms of alienation and create authentic forms of collective action, while his analysis of the inevitable institutionalization of such movements helps explain the challenges faced by contemporary political organizations and social movements. The tension between individual freedom and collective action that runs throughout Sartre's political philosophy continues to be relevant to contemporary debates about the relationship between personal responsibility and social justice, individual rights and collective goods, authenticity and political effectiveness. The integration of philosophical rigor with literary creativity and political engagement that characterizes Sartre's work provides a model for contemporary intellectuals who seek to make philosophy relevant to broader public discussions of social and political issues. His demonstration that philosophical ideas can be given concrete expression in literature, political activism and biographical analysis without losing their intellectual content or critical edge offers resources for philosophers who want to engage with public issues without sacrificing philosophical rigor. The breadth and depth of Sartre's philosophical system, spanning ontology, psychology, ethics, politics and aesthetics, continues to provide resources for contemporary philosophers, political theorists, and anyone seeking to understand the human condition in its full complexity. His vision of human beings as radically free and fully responsible, situated within concrete historical circumstances, but not determined by them, remains as challenging and relevant today as when he first articulated it in the dark days of occupied France. Part 15. The Systematic Unity of Sartre's Philosophy. The extraordinary scope and systematic unity of Sartre's philosophical achievement becomes fully apparent only when we consider how his insights in phenomenology, ontology, psychology, ethics, politics and aesthetics form a coherent whole that addresses every major dimension of human existence. From his early discovery of phenomenology through his mature political philosophy, Sartre consistently developed and refined a unified vision of human beings as free, responsible, and fundamentally engaged with their world and with each other. This systematic unity distinguishes Sartre's work from that of many contemporary philosophers who specialize in narrow technical problems, offering instead a comprehensive philosophy of human existence that remains relevant to the full range of questions that human beings face in their concrete historical situations. The phenomenological foundation established in his early work provides the methodological basis for all of Sartre's later philosophical investigations. His radical interpretation of intentionality as fundamentally realistic, his analysis of the structure of consciousness as transparent to its objects rather than closed in on itself, and his demonstration that the ego is a transcendent object rather than the immanent foundation of consciousness, establish the conceptual framework within which all of his later insights develop. The analysis of imagination and nothingness reveals the fundamental capacity of human consciousness to transcend any given situation and to constitute new possibilities for action and value, while the investigation of bad faith and authenticity shows how this capacity for transcendence can be either denied through self-deception or embraced through authentic choice. The analysis of intersubjectivity reveals how human consciousness is fundamentally social and how our relationships with others both threaten and make possible authentic existence. The ontological analysis developed in Being and Nothingness provides the systematic foundation that unifies all of these phenomenological insights into a coherent account of human existence. The distinction between being for itself and being in itself captures the fundamental difference between conscious existence and mere thinghood, while the analysis of freedom and responsibility shows how human existence is characterized by the constant necessity of choosing who we are without ultimate foundation or guarantee. The temporal structure of human existence, our existence as beings who are always projecting ourselves toward future possibilities while taking up our past in new ways, explains both the possibility of authentic self-creation and the constant temptation to flee from freedom through various forms of bad faith. This ontological analysis provides the framework within which Sartre's later investigations of politics and history develop, showing how individual freedom operates within concrete social and economic conditions that both constrain and make possible different forms of human existence. The development of existential psychoanalysis represents Sartre's most systematic attempt to understand how individual human beings create themselves through their fundamental choices while remaining situated within particular historical and social conditions. By rejecting the Freudian notion of the unconscious while maintaining the insight that human behavior has a deeper unity and meaning than is immediately apparent, Sartre develops a method for understanding individual lives that respects both human freedom and the concrete constraints within which that freedom operates. The biographical studies of Baudelaire, Genet, and Flaubert demonstrate how this method can be applied to understand particular individuals in their full complexity, revealing both the universal structures of human existence and the irreducible particularity of individual choice and situation. These studies also show how individual choices are always made within historical situations that provide both the material conditions and the cultural possibilities within which human freedom can operate. The political philosophy developed in the critique of dialectical reason represents Sartre's most ambitious attempt to integrate his existentialist insights with a systematic analysis of social and economic structures. By developing the concepts of the Practico-Inert, seriality and groups in fusion, Sartre shows how individual freedom operates within social conditions that can either support or undermine the possibility of authentic existence. The analysis of how human labour becomes sedimented into material structures that then constrain future human action provides a framework for understanding how social oppression operates while maintaining that this oppression can be resisted through collective action that temporarily overcomes the atomization and alienation characteristic of life under the domination of the Practico-Inert. The tension between individual freedom and collective action that runs throughout this analysis reflects Sartre's consistent commitment to understanding human existence as simultaneously individual and social, free and situated, responsible and conditioned by circumstances beyond individual control. The integration of literature and philosophy throughout Sartre's career demonstrates his conviction that both forms of expression are necessary for adequately understanding and communicating the full complexity of human existence. The philosophical analyses provide the conceptual rigor needed to understand the universal structures of human existence, while the literary works provide the imaginative concreteness needed to show how these structures operate in particular situations and individual lives. The biographical studies integrate both approaches by using philosophical concepts to understand individual cases, while using individual cases to test and refine philosophical understanding. This integration reflects Sartre's broader conviction that philosophy must remain engaged with concrete historical and political realities rather than retreating into purely academic speculation, and that intellectual work must demonstrate its practical relevance to the pressing questions that human beings face in their lived experience. The systematic unity of Sartre's philosophy also appears in his consistent commitment to human freedom and responsibility across all domains of his work. Whether analyzing individual consciousness, interpersonal relationships, social and political structures, or artistic creation, Sartre consistently maintains that human beings are fundamentally free to choose their response to their situation, even when that situation involves severe constraints and limitations. This commitment to freedom is balanced by an equally strong commitment to responsibility, both individual and collective, for the choices we make and their consequences for ourselves and others. The combination of radical freedom and radical responsibility provides the ethical foundation for all of Sartre's work, from his early analyses of bad faith and authenticity through his later political engagement with movements for social liberation. In a world still struggling with questions of authenticity, responsibility, oppression and liberation, Sartre's philosophy continues to offer profound insights into what it means to be human. His demonstration that human existence is characterized by fundamental freedom and responsibility. His analysis of how this freedom operates within concrete historical and social conditions, and his investigation of how individual and collective action can create more authentic possibilities for human existence, provide resources for contemporary philosophical, political and personal reflection that remain as relevant today as when they were first developed. The breadth and depth of his systematic vision, combined with his consistent commitment to the practical relevance of philosophical reflection, makes Sartre's work an indispensable resource for anyone seeking to understand the human condition in its full complexity, and to act responsibly within that understanding. As we continue to face challenges of individual authenticity and collective justice, environmental destruction and social transformation, technological change and cultural conflict, Sartre's philosophy provides conceptual tools and ethical insights that remain essential for thoughtful engagement with the fundamental questions of human existence.